Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all here on a bright, sunny afternoon here in Holland. It's going to be a great day and a great day to learn about the Shoreline and the work of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So thank you for being here. Just wanted to briefly say, I usually don't get up before class, but I wanted to let you all know that today is a first time for HASP. We're doing this for the first time ever, where we have Jim here in person, and we have two of his colleagues joining us from the Detroit area. So they will be joining in after Jim is done. This is in 3 parts, okay? So I asked for your patience a little bit as we figure this out. I don't think we're gonna have any issues because we got some competent help in the back. David Blatt is running our course technicians podium in the back. So thank you to David for being here and helping with that. But just know that if the screen flickers for a second, or we might end up in PowerPoint somewhere, we'll get where we need to go. We've had a great presentation here from Jim, Jesse, and John. Say that 3 times fast, right? But just wanted to give you all that heads up, and thank you all for being here in person, and thank you to everyone who's joining us virtually. You can all turn and wave to all of our friends joining us at home. They wanted to stay and enjoy the sun from wherever they are, and I know we have some people joining us from Florida today, so they are enjoying their 80-degree weather while we're here in our 18-degree weather, okay? So with that, I will hand it off to our coordinator, Gordon Stedjink, to get us started. Thank you all again.
And then my turn to say good afternoon. And I am not Susan Couch, the coordinator. I'm Gordon, the microphone toter. I will take your questions during Q&A. And it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Luke, who's with the Army Corps of Engineers in the Detroit office, and his colleagues. I assume he'll introduce them as they come on. A few things, be sure your ringtones don't occur. I know it's your favorite ringtone, but the rest of us don't like it. So thank you very much. And without further ado, Jim Luke.
All right. Well, thank you all again. Yeah, I'm Jim Luke. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. My job there is our outreach coordinator and our interagency program manager. So essentially, what I do on a day-to-day basis is go and talk with communities that are having issues either along shoreline. It could be flooding. It could be an environmental restoration type project. It could be a navigation project, and try to help those communities through core programs that Congress has authorized. So I'll get into the different missions that the Corps has and some of the programs that we have, and then some of the communities along Lake Michigan that you all are familiar with that Corps is currently working with. So really want to thank you all for being here today. Really looking forward to this. And I have a couple of my colleagues online, John Imbernoni, he's in our operations office, which means he works on a lot of our navigation projects and dredging. And then Jesse McNinch out of our hydraulics and hydrology office, and he's a hydraulic engineer, and those guys will introduce themselves when they jump on, obviously. But I just wanted to kind of let you know who they were, and we are splitting it up into 3 sections. So I'm going to provide a general overview of the Corps and the missions that we have. And then Jesse's going to go next, talk about coastal processes here in Lake Michigan and specifically riptides. And then John Imbernoni is going to talk about our navigation program. So yeah, each one of those is slated to be about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes after that for Q&A and discussion. So yeah, please hold any questions you have until the Q&A, and we'll be happy to answer those at that time once Gordon gives you the microphone. So definitely, I want to thank Susan Couch for inviting us. I know she couldn't be here today, and thank you, Susan. Appreciate it. And, a little jealous of you being down in Florida. A little chilly up here today, but at least it's sunny, so we have that. I also want to thank Ian, David, and Gordon as well for setting this up today and for making it seamless and easy for us to get up here and do a presentation for y'all and mix it between in-person and hybrid. So really appreciate that as well. So anyway, with that, why don't we get started? So I wanted to provide just a broad view of the Corps of Engineers and where we are. So the Corps works worldwide. We have offices over in Europe and Africa, the Middle East and other areas of the world, obviously, as well as the United States. And we have several offices that we call them district offices and division offices. So we're broken out. Headquarters is the highest level there in Washington, D.C. Under them are the division offices, which are the large geographic areas you see depicted in the different colors here. Green is the division that we're in here, the Lakes and Rivers Division. And then underneath that are district offices. And I have a map that'll show you some of the different districts. And then even under that, we have area offices. So when the Corps is involved in construction projects through dredging or environmental restoration or flooding, the area offices has most of our construction field folks in it. And the closest area office to you all is in Grand Haven. We have one right at the core structure there, the breakwater, and right on the Riverwalk. So if you're familiar with Grand Haven, probably walked by our office many times. All right, so in the Great Lakes region, we do have 3 district offices. We have Detroit District, which is my home office, but we also work very closely with the Buffalo District and Chicago District offices. The territories of those, or the areas of responsibility of those districts, are kind of highlighted in those different colors there. And the leaders of each district are highlighted there as well. So we cover all 5 Great Lakes, 8 states. Within the Great Lakes watershed, there are 75 congressional members, 104, more than 104 miles of navigation structures or breakwaters, things like that. And then, over 4,500 feet of coastline along the Great Lakes. So large area, lots going on, and lots of projects and cool things that we're doing these days. All right, so again, here's kind of a breakdown of the Detroit District office. And as I highlighted, we have a office here in Grand Haven, or right down the street in Grand Haven. We have an office in Northern Indiana in South Bend. We have an area office in Detroit. We also have our headquarters, or the district office headquarters is in Detroit, downtown in the Federal Building. We have an office in Bay City, Sault Ste. Marie, if y'all have ever been there, the Soo Locks facility. That is the Detroit District's largest project. And I'll have a little bit more on that later. But we have a large field office up there with about 100 plus people at it. And then we also have an office in Marquette, Michigan, and then Duluth, Minnesota. All right, so before I kind of get into missions, I just want to talk about how the Corps of Engineers is able to do work. In order for the Corps to get involved in a project, we need an authorization from Congress. So Congress comes out with bills every, for the Corps of Engineers, about every 2 years. A Water Resources Development Act is developed, and within that Water Resources Development Act are laws that allow the Corps of Engineers to do work. And it doesn't like reset everything when the new word, we call it WRDA, when the new WRDA comes out, it kind of adds on to the existing laws that we have. And they could strike through and say this law is no longer active and here's the new one. But typically, we'll get a few new authorizations each year under that Water Resources Development Act. And I'll give you a quick example of one. Within the state of Michigan, the Corps of Engineers had an authority to assist with combined sewer separation. So if you're familiar with sewers, we have sanitary sewer, which is when you flush your toilet, it typically goes down the sanitary sewer. And then when there's storm sewers that carry rainwater. In combined systems, the sanitary and the stormwater are all combined into one system. So when you get a large rain event, that water could dump out into your rivers and ultimately your Great Lakes. So under the recent Water Resource Development Act, we had an authority to separate combined sewers. We wanted to expand that. A lot of communities, including several around here, Benton Harbor, Flint, Detroit, they have had issues with lead water pipes and things like that. So Congress reached out to us and says, how can we expand your authority to include, the Corps being able to help with this problem of, removing lead pipes and things like that. So we told them, here's what it could say, and they went back and kind of changed the language, and now that was passed in December, and we're able to now assist communities that have those issues with that, along still with the combined sewer issue. So that didn't go away either. So it was a quick example, but authorization, that's the law. And then, that's great. You get the law, but then you need the money to do the project. And that's where the appropriation comes in. So every year you hear about the president's budget. That's where the president and Congress and Senate come together, form a bill, and provide the funds for federal agencies to do work. And so that's where we typically get our funding. And so our appropriations that we get are mostly from the Energy and Water Development Appropriations Act. And if you all have heard of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI, that's another appropriation that we use typically here in the Detroit district. All right, so the Corps' primary missions, you probably think of the Corps of Engineers as dredging, and that is our main mission. Navigation is a lot of what we do, but we also do a lot of work in flood risk management. We have a hydropower mission, which I'll highlight, environmental stewardship, or ecosystem restoration type projects. We have a recreation program. We have a regulatory program. So any work in the Great Lakes, the Corps issues permits to do that type of work. We have an emergency management office. So if there's flooding, if there's things like that, the Corps can come in. We have, the ability to help with sandbags and HESCO barriers, things like that to help minimize the flood impacts. We also have an interagency and international support program, and that's my normal role, and that's working with other federal agencies so that, if the Fish and Wildlife wants to build something, they don't really have engineers to build things. So they can come to the Corps and say, hey, we need your expertise to award a construction contract. Corps can step in, help them with that. So that agencies, Fish and Wildlife hiring 100 engineers that, for a project that may take 5 years, they can come and ask us and avoid that duplication. And then, last but not least, cultural and tribal coordination. So we work a lot with tribes and the state historic preservation offices and folks like that to make sure that the projects we're doing are not impacting those sensitive cultural and tribal properties. All right, I'm going to start zipping through here. I'm probably we got 5 minutes left already. All right, so navigation. I'm not going to get into this. John's going to talk about this quite a bit, but there are many harbors along the Great Lakes. Again, when we dredge these, it's by an appropriation from Congress. So we have standing authorities to dredge all of the federal harbors, but we don't dredge all of them on a regular basis because Congress appropriates funds for those, typically based on the amount of commercial traffic that's coming through, or those large freighters that you see. And I'll save the rest for John. Again, flood risk management, I kind of hit on this. We do monitor and forecast water levels on the Great Lakes. So if you all are interested in, what those levels have been, where we think they're going, you can look at our website and there's information on water levels there. And we also get into inspecting levees and flood protection projects like that. And under our flood risk management program, we also have the ability to construct new flood risk management projects. And a lot of our projects are really, in order to qualify for a project, a lot of times they have to be economically justified. So we're not going to build a levee to protect a park that's flooding. There would have to be a lot of homes or larger public facilities that would be impacted in order for the Corps to have justification to construct a project like that. All right, I mentioned hydropower. So up at the Sioux Locks, the Corps of Engineers actually has a hydropower plant. And this plant provides 100% of the power for the Corps to run the Sulaks up there. And if you've ever been up there, it is a large, impressive facility that manages the freighters going from Lake Superior down to Lake Huron. And if you get a chance, go swing by. It is really cool. And then outside of that 100% that we use for the Sulaks, it supplies 20% for the rest of the Upper Peninsula as well, of the Eastern Upper Peninsula. And yep, it's the oldest generating unit in Corps of Engineers inventory. So it's been online for almost 100 years now. All right, I mentioned environmental stewardship. The Corps of Engineers does a lot of ecosystem restoration projects. We also partner with a lot of other federal agencies to help them with their ecosystem restoration projects or sediment cleanup. We work a lot with the Environmental Protection Agency on sediment remediation projects. You had an area of concern in Muskegon here. We work closely with them to execute several projects that removed contaminated sediment from the lake and the tributaries going into the lake. So, big mission there. We also are involved a lot with invasive species. We do sea lamprey traps down in the Chicago area. We have a large facility that helps keep the invasive carp out of Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes. And right now there's electric barriers, and they're in the process of constructing a larger barrier that will be more permanent than the electro barriers that they have currently. We coordinate a lot on federal endangered species. On all of our projects, we're required to do that with Fish and Wildlife Service. So we've also constructed habitat for piping plover on purpose and on accident. And I don't know if John Bernoni's going to cover this one, but we built a facility up in Green Bay. We call it the Cat Island chain. It's a dredge material management facility, but it also protects a large wetland complex. Well, the first year we went and placed material in there, it was sandy material and an endangered species. The piping plover showed up year one and has been there ever since. So awesome story. It presents some challenges as far as our operations goes, because now you got to watch out for the birds, but really cool story and something we try to highlight. Just again, we do a lot of compliance under the National Environmental Policy Act. Every federal project that we're involved in is required to have NEPA compliance. And then we do a lot of sediment sampling and analysis as well. All right, I mentioned Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and our work with EPA. Won't get into that too much more. We have a couple other programs that help with removal or restoration of habitat. We've done a couple dam removal projects under that, one in Frankenmuth. We've removed 2 dams up in Traverse City on the Boardman River. There's another one kind of in the works up there. And we have several other requests in Boyne Falls, Portage, Michigan. There's a few floating around out there, that Lansing, Michigan, that we're hoping to get funded to remove. So we'll see where those go. All right, I mentioned recreation. We do have 2 visitor centers at the Corps of Engineers. So if you're ever up in Duluth, we have a maritime museum up there. The really cool little spot right on the lake, right by the lift bridge. If you've ever been to Duluth, there's a large lift bridge there. Definitely recommend checking that one out. And then up in Sault Ste. Marie, the visitor center at Canal Park. And I believe that's a spot you can watch the freighters come through the lock there. All right, regulatory program. I'll hit on this real quick. I mentioned that we authorize or evaluate permits for work in the Great Lakes and waters of the Great Lakes. So we look at permits under over 2,700 miles along the lake and all waters in northern Indiana. So jurisdictions are a little different. I won't get into that too much, but the state agency here in Michigan has kind of taken over the inland areas so that there's not duplication of federal and state actions. They've kind of taken in our program and administer it. And then, just some quick numbers on the number of permits, over 2,300, and this is in 2021. I apologize, these aren't updated. 2,300 general permits. Those are usually ones that happen really quick in about 30 days, and then over 125 individual permits, which take a little longer. They require public notice and things like that prior to being authorized. And then we also complete compliance inspections as well as jurisdictional determination, and that's essentially, do you even need a permit? So if you're on a Great Lake, you need one. If it's inland a bit, on a waterway, a lot of times there's some other circumstances that we would look at. I mentioned emergency management. So most recent example, when the water levels were high here in the Great Lakes, we went out and did a lot of sandbagging. Detroit, South Haven, we had some HESCO barriers. I think that picture up there in the top left is South Haven. So they were getting water when the winds were coming out of the west. They were getting water blowing up into their water treatment facility, which is kind of right by their parking lot there. And so we put some HESCO barriers up to kind of stop that water from coming in and impacting their facility. We also support the nation in hurricanes and other national emergencies. The Detroit district did work directly with FEMA and the state of Michigan to construct 2 alternate care facilities during the COVID crisis. We built one at Cobo, and this would be to handle people that got sick and if the hospitals were full, they were going to come to these facilities. So one in Detroit at Cobo Arena, and then another up in Novi at the convention center there. So luckily neither facility was used very heavily, but for a week or two there, it was looking kind of scary. So all right. I mentioned this already, a lot of work with other agencies to support their projects. We work with the Army Reserve Center. We've done some projects at Selfridge, most recently a flood study for them because they're right on Lake St. Clair and vulnerable to flooding. And tribal and cultural coordination. Again, we work a ton with tribes. They have a lot of needs, a lot of issues on some of their lands with flooding and wild rice, things like that they historically have relied upon is kind of disappearing with changing conditions in the climate and their habitat. So a lot of studies to figure out how we can restore those types of things and reduce flooding and impacts on their land. So and we also coordinate with them on a lot of all of our federal projects as well. All right, so just a quick highlight on some of the projects that we have been involved in recently on Lake Michigan. In Muskegon, we were working with EPA on the area concern there. That work has recently wrapped up, but we're still supporting an EPA Superfund project at Ott Story. We have a flood study going on up at the Torch Lake Elk Lake River system up in near Charlevoix. They were having some flooding issues up there. Corps of Engineers going in and doing some hydraulic modeling and things like that to understand why they're having their flooding and if there's any potential solutions. And then those are both funded. The projects that we have not gotten funded yet, South Haven, Michigan has they're interested in some flood protection at their water treatment facility. Ludington and Muskegon both have water treatment facilities with some pretty significant erosion occurring up there. And so we've submitted some requests for funding for both of those projects to kind of shore that shoreline up. And then Pentwater, Michigan recently submitted a request to analyze erosion and accretion along their property. So, and then accretion is the accumulation of sand, and obviously erosion is, the sand disappearing. So if there's questions about that, I can certainly, we could talk about that later during Q&A. And again, wanted to highlight real fast I mentioned the SULOCs quite a bit. So we do have we had an authority on the books for 30 or 40 years to construct a new lock up at the SULOCs, and essentially the point of that is redundancy in the system. Right now, I believe it's 95% of the iron ore for the entire United States goes through the Poe lock, which is the existing lock we have. Oh, I'm sorry. it says PO there. That one's currently in place. The fear is that if a boat runs into that gate or, something happens to that lock, there's a mechanical failure. We can't transport iron ore throughout the United States. There's no other alternate means of transportation. And so in the last few years, we've gotten an appropriation from Congress. I believe it is about $3.2 billion now to construct a new lock so that, we can have that redundancy in the system and not worry about failure, which would cause massive impacts to the U.S. economy. So, the picture on your left is what it looks like currently. So they're going to demolish the Sabin and Davis lock and create the new lock in that area. Those Sabin and Davis are currently unused. And then the MacArthur is going to stay in service. It's a smaller lock, so it can't fit those large freighters that haul that iron ore. So that's really, the most important project that we have going on right now. And I don't know if it's the largest project in the country, but it's right up there. Super important stuff going on up there. And then I thought this was cool. This is just a picture of the potential new chamber and what it's going to look like from a computer image. And I just like the image. So wanted to show that to y'all. And I think that's all I have. So appreciate y'all listening to me and look forward to the Q&A session. And I will turn it over to Jesse, and I apologize for stealing about 5 minutes. But I think we can bleed into the Q&A a little bit. So thank y'all.
Thank you, Jim. Let me see if I can share my screen now.
Do I have to unshare up here, Ian? Okay. All right, we see you, Jesse.
See me? Can you see my screen now?
We see your screen. It's not full screen on our end. I don't know if that was supposed to look like, Ian.
Here we go.
Oh, there it goes. Now we got you.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, Jim. And I guess we'll have our question session a little later. But if there's someone, please shout. Maybe I'll rely on you, Jim. If I say something that's very unclear and it needs to be cleared up right then, hopefully I'll see it maybe with a hand raise or something along those lines. But as Jim said, my name is Jesse McNinch. I'm fairly recent to the Detroit district. I'm a physical scientist in hydrology and hydraulics, and I started this past summer. I'm going to focus on rip currents today, but I have quite a long history of research and practice in coastal related things. So I'm happy to expand it as we do our Q&A on broader than rip currents. I started actually as a professor in oceanography, I guess 2 decades ago, spent about a decade doing that. And then I spent another decade or so doing research, mostly for military related things. And I'll circle back to that towards the end. And I think you'll see what the connection is between what we would call civil works and the Army Corps versus military. But a lot of times there's nice dovetailing between the two. And in fact, what I talk about with rip currents, you'll see that connection. But what I've set up today is to the outline is shown here. Hopefully you can see my highlight, but wanted to start with just defining exactly what are rip currents, so we're all talking on the same page. How dangerous are they? What causes them? And I think when you see, once we have explained our understanding of the causes of them, most importantly is how we can avoid them. And specifically to talk about knowing where to look and what to look for, and then of course when to look. And then near and dear to my heart, and it connects to what I was just talking about earlier research that we were supporting the military. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about our ongoing development of a system that would actually allow us to spot the rip currents while they're occurring. So what are rip currents? There's so many descriptions. In fact, I heard Jim and I did not talk about this earlier, but he used the term that you hear often, hear rip tides. That's not what we're talking about. And I'm just playing with you a little bit, Jim, on that one. But yeah, it has nothing to do with tides. Tides, as many of you probably know, are driven by things, mostly the sun and the moon, and the pull of that. We have very, very little tidal effect on the Great Lakes, but rip currents are, in short, strong surface currents that are directed offshore. And I put a couple of things here. The top two images are actual images of the rip currents, but let me start down here, which is a diagram, and I'll use the same terminology throughout the talk. But if this is like looking straight down at a map, and this light yellow area is the beach, so it's running, in this case, say east to west or left to right. And then offshore, these little wavy lines, that's representing waves that are flowing towards the beach. And so rip currents are strong currents that are flowing perpendicular, not parallel, but perpendicular, and they're largely directed offshore. And you'll see it, they're not, nothing is exact, both in their timing, their size, and how long they are. But just to give you some rough descriptions of what we're talking about here, they're often about 10 to 30 feet wide. Here's an example. This was some work done by NOAA that I'll talk about later on. But what NOAA was able to do is they released this green fluorescent dye right about here, and they were able to watch it get entrained by the rip current and then move seaward. So to orient you, the beach is along this way. There's someone's beach umbrella. So we're looking top down, almost like in map view, and you can see that current carrying the dye seaward or offshore. And same way here, here's another example. I believe this was from the Oregon coast, but you can see the shoreline here, and then where I have the arrow, the rip current that's directed seaward or offshore in this direction. And they can be quite significant. They can reach speeds up to 5 knots, or almost 8 to 10 miles an hour. You cannot swim against it, and you'll see that reflected in the fatality statistics that I'll show next. So it's really nothing you can swim against. They're quite strong, and they typically extend from, again, about the shoreline to out past where the breakers are, where the waves are breaking. They do not pull you underwater, but often what happens, we believe, is that people are caught in the rip currents. They are pulled seaward, and they try to swim directly against it, and just eventually become so fatigued from that effort that they end up inhaling water or getting in distress from that. So some statistics are really, how dangerous are they? And in this day of COVID and all those numbers that we all looked at over the last few years, I think numbers sometimes can be almost paralyzing. But I did want to put this out in the sense of just to give you a measure of it, in that, because when we look at the statistics of fatalities related to weather and ocean related fatalities, it's significant. Here's a table that shows the deaths associated with, on average, cyclones or hurricanes, bushfires, floods, our scary favorite, sharks. So rip currents way exceed that. It's really, in terms of weather and ocean related fatalities, it's second only to deaths related to heat related or heat strokes. And some more statistics about that I think does a nice job describing the real threat that rip currents pose is this, the figure on the left hand shows just in the US, the number of fatalities associated or that were occurred in the surf zone. And you can see in 2015 across the nation, 50% of the fatalities in the surf zone were due to rip currents. The other thing I think that really pops out at me is the image on the right hand, which shows you the demographics of age in 2015 associated with fatalities due to rip currents. And you can see it's essentially children up to parents. I can't see it because of mine, but I think 30 up to 49. And I've got other statistics I can throw out at you later on if people are interested. But the bottom line is it's significant when it comes to problems, distress, and fatalities associated with enjoying the beach and out swimming. And the U.S. Life Saving Association estimate that it exceeds 100 a year. So what causes them? Again, that's part of, I think, if my hope is that as we talk through and we explain our understanding, we have lots to learn, but if you understand the basics of what creates them, I think it helps prepare on how to avoid them, which we'll get into next. But the first part of what causes rip currents is a piling up of water. Well, in our field, we call it water setup. And I've exemplified it with this little diagram on the upper left here. You can see offshore and this to the right, going up shallower water up to the beach and structures, businesses, whatever, on this left-hand side. And so we get water piling up or setting up against the shoreline. And that is very similar to what I think we can all intuitively understand is when you look at a dam, if you go to Hoover Dam or many of our other dams, you see a pileup of water from a river or a lake, you see a big reservoir, and then the power of that water that comes out of the bottom. That's basically the hydraulic head or the power of that water. And that's exactly what we see along our shorelines too. You have water piling up. It's not as dramatic as a dam, but it makes a difference. And even a matter of like, I don't know, a half a foot or a foot of water piling up against the shoreline can make significant power or power potential. The other part of that is, so we understand that it's driven, or the underlying force is water piling up against the beach, but what pushes the water against the shoreline? And it's really two things, especially here on the Great Lakes. It's wind just blowing over the water. And this example is a picture of very strong wind blowing across the water, and you can see that distinctly. But even light winds, wind moves the water, the surface of the water, about 5% of the magnitude. So a 20-knot wind blowing over Lake Superior or across Lake Michigan to your side, to Western Michigan, if it persists for several days, that can push a significant amount of water and pile it up against the shoreline. And the other common driver or force that pushes water up against the shoreline that creates this power I referred to are waves. And I know you can all sit and stand out on the beach and look out, and you'll see those waves. Well, the longer period, which is really the longer time between wave crests that approach the beach, the longer period they are, then that's the more water is able to pile up against the beach, just due to the asymmetry of those waves approaching the beach. And the second part that I wanted to explain is you have the water piling up or setting up against the shoreline, like I just spoke or just described. And again, here we have our diagram that I showed before, the beach looking at top down, like from a map view. You have the beach here, and you have the water being moved by either winds or these waves, and this piling up against the shoreline. But the rip currents are flowing offshore from that. But the other factor that we need to consider is the alongshore currents. And that's what I'm showing in these bottom images. So this lower left-hand image is an example as if we were in a balloon just offshore. So this yellow area here, that's the beach. We're looking back towards the beach, and these little white things that I'm drawing my cursor on, those are the crests of the waves. And you'll see that the way I drew them here is that they're approaching the beach and they're hitting this area of the beach on the shoreline before they're hitting that area. So they're approaching at an angle. You can see it nicely in this aerial photo of a beach with a pier that's sticking out there. You can see how the wave crests are approaching the shoreline at an angle. And what's key about that is the strength of that current that flows along the shoreline, along shore or parallel to the shoreline, is driven by two things. And I put this in for any of the math geeks that might be in the audience. The strength of the longshore current is a function of how high the waves are, what they're breaking, they're big, tall breaking waves, and what that angle is. So the angle, as the angle steepens or gets greater, say up to 45 degrees, that's going to increase the magnitude or the strength of that flow. So you'll have water being piled up against the beach. It needs to squirt out. It needs to balance itself, just like a dam piling up or holding water back. And you also have this alongshore current that's flowing along the beach. So those are the two factors that I think can hopefully explain how to avoid them and what to look for. So I put this up as sort of three factors to know where to look for them, and I'll connect back to what we just talked about, and what to look for exactly. What do they look like, and then when to look for them. So the first piece of that is, again, where to look for them. And I'll go back to our dam example. In this case, where a longshore current, it's pretty easy that if all of us were standing along this shoreline of this old broken down reservoir, you would all be able to point directly to where you'd expect the strongest flow, where the dam is crumbling. So where there's an avenue for this power potential, this water or this head to flow out. It makes sense. Well, that's really similar to what happens with rip currents. So back to our little diagrams, this is a side view. Again, this is offshore with the waves flowing towards the beach from right to left. And I have it showing going over an underwater sandbar. Hopefully many of you have been out on the beach with your kids, or you are kids, and you've been out on the beach and you wade, and usually you wade into the water, go down to your knees, sometimes down to your waist, maybe your chest. Before then, you will often crawl up onto an underwater sandbar that's just offshore of the beach. And that's very, very common. But what also is common is that there's usually breaks or lows along these sandbars. So the sandbars act a bit like this old crumbling dam. And just like I show on this, where there's a hole or breach in the dam, in these holes or lower areas in the sandbars, that's often a location where the rip currents flow out. So here's a picture. I believe I might have even taken this one, where you have the beach in the background along the shoreline, and here's the sandbar. That's this sort of light area. So it's just underwater. I believe this happens to be on the East Coast, so it's low tide. So the sandbar is just below the water. But here the water had piled up, and you can see how that rip current, in this case, the water piled up here has to get out, wants to release, and it's flowing through that break in the bar, just like I showed in this diagram. Now, the other areas that you often want to look for rip currents are along structures like piers or pilings that I have exemplified here in the middle, or jetties, groins, any structures that are extending out into the surf zone, typically perpendicular to the trend of the beach. So in other words, from the beach towards offshore. And the reason those play an important role is back to what I spoke about earlier, with you have water piled up against the beach, and that's creating that power, but you also have that alongshore current driven by the waves approaching at an angle. And when you combine those two, what will happen is you'll have water piled up that needs to go somewhere, and then you have these alongshore flows that will interact with these structures and then deflect seaward. So you'll have a combination of rip currents being released, or that power being released, either through breaks in the bar, holes in the bar, or structures that deflect the alongshore current and allow that water to more easily flow out. So what to look for? And this, I'm showing some pictures, and I think when you all look at it, I know I look at them and I say, oh, well, that's pretty easy to see. But I do want to make the point that I'm giving you the very best images that I've been able to pick up through my career. And you'll notice that almost all of them are from higher elevation, because you're looking down at them and you can see it. It's much more difficult, even to the trained eye, even to lifeguards and others, necessarily seeing these features when you're standing on the beach. But what you hopefully can see or look for are plumes of sediment. Here's a great example of that. So this little colored area that I'm showing here with the red arrow on the upper left-hand side, that's sediment that's suspended from the bed, from the lake bed or from the seabed, and it's being carried out past the breakers seaward. So you'll see these plumes. Here's an example of foam that's created from the waves breaking, and that foam is being carried out. Here's a combination of both sediment plume and foam being pulled out. So when you're standing on the beach, it is harder to see than from when you're elevated like this. But if you're able to pick up any areas where there's plumes of either murkier looking water or foam, that is a telltale sign of a rip current. The other thing to look for are these same plumes of either sediment or foam, but near structures. And here's some examples that I've collected through the years. Here's an old broken down growing. It was a seawall basically that was going from the beach towards offshore, and you can see, hopefully your eye can pick out the plume of the foam that shows the outline of the presence of that rip current. Here's another. This is from down in Puerto Rico. Nice fine whitish sand and picked up and shown in this plume here. I believe this is from the West Coast, California. Here's a very large plume, and you can see that it's extending almost 3 times the width of the surf zone. So these can extend several hundred football fields seaward of the beach at times. Here's another example near a growing where the rip current is moving seaward there. Here it's more subtle. This is taken what your eye would see if you're standing along the beach looking offshore. And the other thing I want to point out is, if you see the structure, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rip current is going to be right beside that structure, because several things are happening. And I could go into more detail, but I know we have a time limit. But you have the water piled up against the beach, like I talked about in this area, but you have that longshore current flowing, in this case, from left to right. Well, that longshore current is also piling water up against this structure. So the most hydraulically efficient area for that water to be released and go seaward is not necessarily right up against the structure, but in fact, it's just off a little bit. So when to look for it. Luckily, there's been some really great work. I want to spend a little bit of time telling you about this, because it was some work I was involved in, the research team that I worked with when I was in both academia and when I first joined the Corps. But it's been best done by NOAA, and many of you may be aware of that NOAA and National Weather Service, most coastal communities provide a daily forecast of rip current conditions. So just like you have a forecast for percent chance of rain or percent chance of thunderstorm, there is also a risk of the presence of rip currents. So the wind is now being provided online through this NOAA system that will tell you the possibility, or the higher possibility or lower possibility, of rip currents occurring in different regions. Now that they were able to do that by combining some information, some very good research done by the part of NOAA scientists, interviewing a bunch of lifeguards over time, as well as an experiment that we and others conducted. This was done with Woods Hole, the oceanographic group in Woods Hole, where we actually rented, or excuse me, we didn't rent, we were the Army Corps. We got a Mike 8, which is an 80-foot landing craft. Here's an example of it. These are what we use to load heavy equipment and tanks, other things, and they can literally run up to the shoreline, beach themselves, and drop the doors, and you will see you can drive off. The reason we got this is that these Mike 8s have 2 very, very large propellers, and it's okay to run them aground. So what we're able to do is literally blow open a hole in the sandbar to create conditions for instrumenting and measuring rip currents. So what I wanted to explain, I'm sorry for the distraction there. My cat just happened to jump up on my desk. One of the many of you can appreciate working from home. the challenge for rip currents, and you can probably already understand, is you can't always go and expect a rip current to happen at a specific location or at a specific time. And as observational scientists, that's a real challenge, because in order to understand it, we need to be able to measure things. We need to put instruments down. We need to be able to ultimately put instruments down, measure it, and model it. And that's a tough thing with something that's very ephemeral and difficult to predict, like rip currents. So we use this landing craft to blow open a hole in the sandbar. Here's a picture of it after we opened up this hole. When I say blow up, I don't mean we use explosives. We use the big propellers to push the sand and move it around and open up a hole through the sandbar. And then we were able to use divers and deploy and put lots of instruments down. So this information taught us a lot, combined with what NOAA has done, allows NOAA now to provide this daily forecast. So there is a better idea now of when to look. And this last part, I'm probably most excited about, because we've been involved in this for quite some time. I talked about in the very beginning, how sometimes our work supporting the military also overlaps and provides a really interesting sidebar for civil works, and in this case for public safety. And what we're working on right now is a system that uses radar, that uses very inexpensive over-the-counter radar, the same radar that you put on your fishing boat to go offshore. We use this over-the-counter radar to actually hunt and look for the current occurrence of rip currents, as well as to look for where those holes in the sandbars are the regions that are very conducive for the location of rip currents occurring. So the spirit is that NOAA is providing a forecast of when you might expect rip currents to happen. We wanted to have a system that lifeguards and others could use to predict or to show exactly when they happen. So the corollary would be, there's a tornado watch, and then ultimately there's a tornado warning. So you know when and where it's actually occurring. This is the when and where, the tornado warning side. So there's a lot here, and we're excited about the many applications, both military as well as things like sediment transport and accretion and erosion and things like that. But focusing on rip currents, what we discovered is that X-band radar can see the foam and the waves very clearly. This little image you see on the lower right is our actual waves moving across the surf zone in real time, washing up along the beach there. And we're able to use math and some clever relationships, and we know that the waves are influenced by what they feel underneath them. So I'll show you an example of that. This one of the things, and this happens oftentimes in research, where you're focusing on something and you're actually surprised at the results. What you're looking at here is an image on the upper left-hand side of Oahu. This is Sunset Beach, Oahu. This actually made the news just last week with the big surfing contest, the Eddy, where they had massive waves hitting this region, and they had that surfing contest. I believe they were over 40-foot tall waves. Well, we were there with a very early model of our radar system. Here you can see it on a little push buggy. We pushed this along the edge of the beach. This was a little walking boardwalk. And the left-hand image is showing you two things. It's showing you the color represents where the sandbars are, or the shallower areas. So the lighter, warmer colors represent shallower, and the cooler colors, the blue, represent deeper. So here is the beach along this region, and you can see the sandbar, and you can also see a little break in the sandbar. The other thing I want to point your eye towards are these vectors, these black arrows. Well, this radar system is not only looking for rip currents, it's not only looking for the sandbars, but it's also showing the direction of all the currents. And so these little black arrows represent the direction of the current. And you can see here that we captured one of these rip currents. Probably the coolest thing I suspect you've all been staring at, because I know I stare at it whenever I play this, is the lower right image that's just looping through. And what you're looking at is the white here that's the foam on the surface of the water. So the beach is this area. The little radar system is sitting here on that boardwalk. And what you're seeing is a real-time movie of what those surface currents are doing. And I'm hoping, as you've sat and watched it while I've been blabbing away on this slide, is you can see this plume of water that's projecting out in this area. It's looping through, but that is a rip current. And this is a pretty rare thing. And we were so delighted that when we were playing back the data, again, we were there for other reasons. We were doing this for the military, for other expeditionary related reasons, but we were delighted that we actually caught in real time this presence of the rip current. So I spoke to this earlier, but just to sort of wrap it up, one of the things we still have more work to do. This is not an operational system. It's still an R&D system that we're developing at the Detroit district. But the vision is that potentially we could have these systems so that lifeguards could use it to patrol the beach in a couple of ways. We could have dedicated stations if there's a beach or an area that's particularly dangerous or particularly busy during certain periods of the year. It would be fairly easy to have one of those radars there that's turned on every hour for lifeguards and other trained personnel to look for them. We have them that we can mount these little radar antennas on a lifeguard on a 4-wheel drive. So when the lifeguards do their hourly or every few hour drives down the beach safety inspection, that system could be turned on to look for it. And again, the other thought would be not necessarily just seeing where the rip current is, but I think it could also be used as a more fine-tuned way to forecast, because that same radar system would identify breaks in the bar where they might occur, and it could be flagged as an area of higher possibility of the occurrence of a rip. And I do want to leave you before we jump into questions with this. I didn't focus on the actual guidelines of what to do, but NOAA and the National Weather Service have fantastic information online with how to respond if and when you are caught in in a rip current. And again, be aware of their fantastic forecasting conditions that they provide. And Jim, I'm assuming we're going to have a question at the end.
Yeah, we're going to do it after John presents. So
okay.
Yeah, appreciate the presentation, Jesse, and I promise not to ever call them riptides again if you take me to Hawaii with you next time.
I was afraid if I teased you too hard, I'd never be invited again. So it's fine.
No, you're good. I can take it. All right, John, are you there? Can't hear you.
I am. Can you guys hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you well.
All right, good volume.
Yeah, sounded great.
All right, excellent. Very shortly, my screen should be coming on. If you can see my PowerPoint.
Yep, we can see it.
All right. Well, very good. All right, you have just the PowerPoint myself, correct?
Yep, I think you're ready to go.
All right, great. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is John Imbranoni. I'm the Navigation Business Line Manager for the Detroit District. Today, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Great Lakes Navigation System, a high-level view of the federal budget process for obtaining funds to perform operation and maintenance of the navigation system. I'd also like to give you a summary of what the maintenance needs of the system are. And then lastly, we'll take a quick look at Grand Haven, Holland, and Saugatuck harbors, since you guys are very familiar with those. And then again, we'll go into the question and answer period. So first, I'd like to start with an overview of what the Great Lakes Navigation is. Great Lakes Navigation is really a navigation system. And the O&M is managed by the Great Lakes Navigation Team, which has representatives from Detroit, Chicago, and Buffalo districts. Kind of Jim alluded to this earlier, but it's a very large system. There are 140 federal harbors on the Great Lakes, 60 of which are high or medium use. There are 80 low use commercial harbors, typically referred to as recreational or emerging harbors. Within the system, there's also the connecting channels of the St. Mary's River, the Detroit River, St. Clair River, and channels in Lake St. Clair. There's also 3 locks within the system. There's the Sioux Locks, the Chicago Lock, and the Black Rock Lock in Buffalo, New York. So The navigation waterways allow for heavy bulk commodities to be delivered economically from source to destination. Throughout American history, industries built up along the lakes where they can take delivery of the bulk commodities. The Great Lakes model is based on waterborne commerce delivering commodities directly to the industry, and other modes are not available or are just not as economical. The Great Lakes system, the NAV system, saves approximately $3.9 billion every year over the next least costly mode of transportation, such as rail or trucking. The Great Lakes Navigation System is a nonlinear interdependent system that carries bulk commodities from source locations to users at the destination ports. The vast majority of Great Lakes nav traffic stays within the Great Lakes system and exchanges commodities between US ports or US and Canadian ports, but almost exclusively on the Great Lakes. There are some salties that come from foreign ports, but the vast majority, about 95%, stays on the Great Lakes. Alternatively, ocean coastal ports primarily trade in containerized commodities, importing from and exporting to those ports overseas. Another key difference between ocean ports and Great Lakes ports is that ocean coastal ports really compete with each other for trade. If one port can't accommodate the traffic coming in, the cargo can easily switch to the next port because this is container traffic to be loaded onto trucks and rail and transported away from the port. In the Great Lakes, commodities can't really be easily moved to the next harbor because the users, like power plants, like the one in Grand Haven, and manufacturing plants are located at the destination harbor. In most cases, rail is not available there. So it really is an interdependent system where those high tonnage harbors really are dependent on those low and moderate tonnage harbors. Jim talked a little bit earlier about our Detroit area of responsibility. So within our Great Lakes system, the Detroit operates and maintains 84 of the 140 federal projects, including deep and shallow draft harbors. The connecting channels are all within our district. We also operate and maintain 9 dredge material disposal facilities in our AOR. And as you can see on the map, our AOR covers all of Michigan, the Lake Superior coastline of projects in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and the Menominee Harbor, which separates Michigan and Wisconsin right here. So for the federal budget process, I wanted to give you just kind of an overview of it, of how we go about getting our funds to form our operation and maintenance within the system. So in general, our operations office develops and submits budget requests for all the federal harbors with an operation and maintenance need. The budget submissions are based on our asset management program, in which we assess the current condition, develop maintenance strategies for the life cycle of the assets, assets being the channels, the navigation structure, the locks. And then we submit funding requests based on those needs, and those requests are ranked and blended within the federal regulation and guidance for the president's budget development. Typically, the president's budget is focused on projects with high or moderate level of commercial navigation. For reference, high commercial use for Great Lakes coastal ports is at least 10 million tons of cargo annually. Moderate use is between 1 and 10 million tons annually, and then low use harbors or wreck harbors, as we often call them, are projects with less than 1 million tons of cargo annually. This graphic kind of shows the timeline in the budget cycle and how we are continually addressing these 3 stages. So each budget cycle, lasts 34 months and includes 3 phases: budget development, budget defense, and budget execution. If you look at the chart between the 2 blue lines, which represents a fiscal year, pardon me, in any given fiscal year, we're executing the current year program while defending the next year's program and developing the budget for the program 2 years out. So those looking at those different phases, just a reminder that we're always referring back to the current fiscal year. Our current fiscal year is 2023. So current fiscal year +1 is 24 and +2 is 25. The budget development phase of the cycle is built for the current fiscal year +2. So during budget development, we utilize our condition assessments and maintenance plans to develop those work packages, and they're ranked within the district by what we feel is important. That's typically based on the state of the condition, how many users and stakeholders are being affected by it. And then we merge those work packages within the Great Lakes on that Great Lakes navigation team. And then those are blended within the division, and the division's packages are blended at a national level. And those programs are submitted to Washington in support of the administration's president's budget request to Congress. The budget defense phase, which is conducted for the current fiscal year +1, during this phase, federal agencies respond to inquiries and data calls to House and Senate budget committees to develop the budget resolution, which is voted on by Congress and then subsequently approved by the president. The last phase of the cycle is budget execution. And this is what happens during the current fiscal year, where the districts are responsible for carrying out the work that was appropriated by Congress to conduct our operation and maintenance of the federal projects. So I want to give a little information about the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. The funds for operating and maintaining the navigation system now comes from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. We often refer to that as HMTF. Prior to 1986, all operation and maintenance was conducted at 100% federal expense from income and other tax sources. The Water Resource and Development Act of '86, or WRDA of '86, established the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, which is a fee collected from the shipping industry. And now all HMTF funds, now HMTF funds all of the O&M of the coastal navigation system, which includes the Great Lakes. There's been some significant changes to HMTF that came out in WRDA 2020 that honestly are good for the Great Lakes navigation system. It stipulated that no less than 13% of the annual national expenditures go to the Great Lakes system. It also stipulated that no less than 15% of the annual national expenditures be used on emerging harbors, or those small and wreck harbors. There was also use of HMTF in the CARES Act of 2020 to support additional O&M of that nav system. So here's a graphic representation of our funding history going back to 2008. You can see a pretty drastic difference of late. The red portion of the graph indicates the president budget level since 2008. Luckily for the Great Lakes, there's been an upward trend since hitting its low point, or recent time low point in 2012 and 2013. There's been, and you can see an additional upward movement or upward trend after the 2020 changes to HMTF, where they increased the funding with the Great Lakes. The green portion of the graph indicates appropriations additional to the president's budget. These typically represent appropriations by Congress in excess of the president's budget request. These have also been a welcome source of O&M funds and have trended upward since 2013. The purple portion of the graph indicates special stimulus actions. You can note one in 2009, that was the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. And then you can also see pretty large spikes in 2022 and 2023. That is a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Both of which, both act and law really were beneficial to the Great Lakes. So looking at the system requirements, this is really what we use those funds appropriated by Congress to do. So our requirements of our nav system can really be broken into four major categories: dredging, dredge material management, navigation structures, and lock reliability. Our most frequent O&M action, Jim talked about this too. Most frequent O&M action is dredging of the navigation channel to allow for safe and efficient movement of commodities through the system. On the Great Lakes, our annual dredging need is about 3.3 million cubic yards of sediment entering the system every year. And in any given year on the Great Lakes, we usually dredge 20 to 30 projects, removing about 3 to 5 million cubic yards of material. Costs can vary pretty widely. Most efficient dredging on the very low end is about $4 a cubic yard. Higher end average is about $30 a cubic yard. Some smaller complex projects can range up into the hundreds of dollars per cubic yard. So you can see if we had 5 million cubic yards at over $100 a cubic yard, it would be pretty costly. The cost of dredging projects are influenced by a lot of factors. There's environmental requirements to ensure proper disposal of contaminated materials. We need to avoid disturbance to fish spawning and negative impacts to other species. Kind of like Jim mentioned with Cat Island, the piping plovers showed up about 20 years sooner than we were shooting for. So it was a great benefit of what we did, but it also created additional operational things we had to do. Small and remote harbors often require large mobilization fees with low productivity rates. On the Great Lakes, we also have a very short dredging season. We have winter shutdowns, we have spring fish spawning and bird habitat, and in the fall we have waves and winds making the outer harbors unsafe. That leaves us really just the summer season to do most of our dredging, which also happens to be peak tourism season, especially in harbors like Grand Haven and Holland. You guys know there's a huge tourism there that surround those structures. Additionally, some types of placement can require multiple handling of material, where that means when you transfer material from barge to truck and then truck to a disposal facility where you finally place the material. Dredge material management. As a result of our most frequent O&M, dredging being our most frequent action, dredge material management, of course, results is one of our biggest and most important challenges. Looking at dredge material management from a historical perspective, prior to 1970, nearly all dredge material was placed in the open waters of the lakes. In 1970, Congress passed the River and Harbor and Flood Control Act that specifically authorized the Corps of Engineers to construct, operate, and maintain spoil disposal facilities on the Great Lakes for the consignment of contaminated dredge materials. Most of the existing facilities were constructed in the late 70s, resulting from that act. There are currently 20 active disposal facilities on the Great Lakes, and they are at about 80% full. As disposal facilities near capacity and sediment is becoming less contaminated, the Corps of Engineers is looking to develop more sustainable methods for dealing with dredge material, often by partnering with local entities for beneficial uses such as mineland reclamation, road projects, fill material for contaminated sites. And this is really going to be a major focus for the Corps of Engineers moving into the near future. It is a national problem, and it is becoming, as highlighted here, it's becoming sort of a critical situation. Some of the challenges we'll be facing as we move into the future for dredge material management is that declining availability of placement sites, the prohibitive cost of constructing new facilities. Some of the later WRDAs created a cost sharing requirement for disposal facilities, so we have to identify a cost share partner. These are very expensive to build and take a long time to get authorized and constructed. So finding a ready, willing, and able cost share partner is a real challenge. Those cost share partners also have to take on the maintenance of that facility after it's done being filled in perpetuity. So it's not necessarily the most attractive deal for folks. There is also a general resistance to open water disposal among the states. There is a perception that dredge material is a waste product. which that has been a perception about it for essentially forever. And it's also hard to find suitable uses for the fine, silty, and organic materials that's often present in dredged material. When it is nice sand beach, or beach sand, we often can use it to nourish the beaches. We do that in Grand Haven and Holland, I believe Saugatuck as well. But that is not always the case for like the inner harbors where it's river sediment. Navigation structures are another major requirement on the Great Lakes. The purpose of federal navigation structures are really to protect the harbor from wave and ice damage, reduce shoaling into the navigation channel, ensure safe navigation by protecting vessels from the wave action. There's also additional benefits such as protecting local infrastructure and recreational tourism attractions as historical structures. Looking at the condition of our structures on the Great Lakes, generally speaking, nearly all of our coastal structures are in need of some level of maintenance and repairs. About 60% of the structures were built prior to World War I, with many known to date back to the mid 1850s as timber crib dam structures. Currently, 40% of them are rated between C to F. The last area we're going to look at is lock reliability. It's critical to the navigation system to have reliable locks. In the Detroit district, we operate and maintain the Soo locks in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. The Soo locks are considered the linchpin of the Great Lakes nav system. That's because it's the only method of waterborne commodities to move from the lower lakes to Lake Superior, getting up to Duluth and some of the major iron producers to bring it down to the lower lakes. It is critical. We operate and maintain the locks as well as the hydropower plant there that Jim had mentioned provides power to the locks and provides about 20% of the power to the southeastern Upper Peninsula. The federal government is making large investments to ensure reliability of this critical infrastructure. There are a lot of funding coming to asset renewal of the existing lock structure, making sure specifically the PO, as the 1,000-foot vessels use the PO, keeping that operational. It is over 50 years old, and we have very minimal shutdowns from the sheer effort of the folks up there, and these additional funding coming in to renovate and update and really help with the reliability. But that being said, it is still one lock. Anything can happen, a vessel strike on the gate, or a mechanical failure. So that really led to the construction of the new lock that Jim had mentioned as well. Huge investment for the country, over $3 billion. It is a mega project, and it is going to be quite a benefit to the entire system, and that is finished construction. Lastly, I figured we would take a look at some of the local harbors you guys are familiar with, talk a little bit about the authorizations there and the conditions there. First up is Grand Haven. Grand Haven Harbor has an authorized navigation channel, north and south piers and revetments, and as Jim mentioned, is home to our Grand Haven resident office that oversees all core construction projects in the West Michigan area of responsibility. The authorizations there date back to the mid 1800s, and coastal structures have been in place there since the 1850s. There's been lighthouses there, on the pier. There's been lighthouses. I think the first lighthouse was on the beach in 1839. That was not a core project. This was, I think, the Bureau of Lighthouses or something similar. So we dredge this outer channel annually and the inner channel on a 2 to 4 year cycle. Currently, we're in the process of rehabbing and improving the piers and revetments there to ensure they withstand aging and provide safe navigation. The South Pier recently had a major resurfacing effort that was completed in 2018. I'm sure folks are probably local folks are probably familiar with that, as that historical catwalk had to be removed and stored off site, and the city was good enough to renovate that while it was off. So after that, the South Pier Head and South Revetment are still in need of some maintenance. Engineering and design are currently underway for those efforts. In the 2022 bipartisan infrastructure law, we received funding to make repairs to some sections of the North Pier and to add a pocket wave attenuator there. So engineering design is currently underway. And then once the wave attenuator has been constructed, you'll see a reduction in wave action in between the piers. We're also seeking additional funds to repair the North Pier and revetment outside of that area. Moving south down the coast, we come to Holland Harbor. Holland Harbor is an authorized navigation channel and a pair of breakwaters, piers, and revetments. Authorizations for this harbor also date back to the 1800s. We dredge the outer channel here and annually, and the inner channel also on a 2 to 4 year cycle. Some repairs are needed on the nav structures. Repairs in the North Revetment are currently being designed, and construction funding is being requested. We're also seeking funding to begin design for repairs to the North Breakwater and the South Breakwater Pier Head. Further down the coast is Saugatuck Harbor. Saugatuck has an authorized navigation channel and piers with pocket wave attenuators and revetments. Authorizations for this harbor date back to the 1890s. We dredge Saugatuck on a 3 to 4 year cycle, and due to somewhat recent renovations, the piers and revetments are in good condition, and we're not currently seeking any funding to do any repairs. Those are one of our better condition structures. That was the end of my slides. Thanks everybody for the chance to give you a look into our navigation system, and then I will turn it back over there for questions.
All right. Well, thank you all. See a couple hands raised back there. Just give you all a heads up. We do have to end at 2:30. I can stick around for about 10-15 minutes afterwards to chat with folks if there's other questions, but just wanted to mention that. So
right here. How does Canada fit into this, since so much of the Great Lakes is on Canada? You have as the Corps of Engineers, good working relationship with Canada?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the slides I have, I didn't hit on it actually at all, but we're members of the International Joint Commission. We work closely with Canada on water levels. A lot of our studies involve Canada. We coordinate with them on projects that would potentially impact them. So absolutely, yeah, we're very, very closely tied in with Canada.
I have a question regarding the Kalamazoo River and the Saugatuck Harbor. Well, there's a private development proposed that would have a marina cutting into the shore of the Kalamazoo River. Is that within the jurisdiction of the Army Corps, and does a private developer have to do the dredging, or you would do the dredging, and in permitting, do you have the power to stop the project if there's environmental concerns for the area on the Kalamazoo River and into the Lake Michigan, near the mouth of Lake Michigan?
Yeah, that's something that definitely would require a permit from our regulatory office. Any work in the waters of the navigable waters, if the project they're doing impacts our navigation channel or our structure, we have another process outside of our regulatory process. We call it our Section 408. I don't even know the name of it, but essentially it's anything that could impact one of our federal projects has to go through another review, and John and his team would look at that to make sure there are no impacts to the federal structure, in addition to the regulatory impacts for work in the waters. So if they have an application in, I'm sure they're reviewing it, and I can give you my card and put you in touch with the regulatory office if you have other questions on that.
This is for our second speaker, and a 1 or 2 sentence answer is plenty. They're curiosity questions from a user. For those 40-foot waves in Hawaii, based on your radar, does a surfer to win the contest want to be in the current, rip current, near the current, or as far away from possible from the current? And the other question has to do with weight. We went through a canal system in Eastern European and Western Europe, and they had 130 locks to cross the Continental Divide. But the most shocking part to us was twice when they built a concrete structure above highways and had the cruise ships go across them. That just blew our minds. How hard is it to do that?
Jesse, I'll let you answer those.
The first one's a little easier. Yes, the surfers, they're probably the first people to ask. They typically know where the rip currents are because they use them actually as shortcuts or escalators to get offshore. The rip currents, they'll ride their surfboards literally through the breaker zone, through the waves. It's a quick way other than paddling to get offshore off of the breakers, and then they ride the waves in. The second part, can you rephrase that? Was the question, why do the ships take the seas head on as they're navigating? Did I follow that correctly?
No, he's gonna re-ask Jesse.
On a river cruise, we went through 130 locks, and I understand locks-ish due to Sioux locks. Twice they had bridges built over highways where they constructed man-made concrete structures where there was no river and there was no canal. They made their own in the air above the highways. That seemed astounding to us, kind of like a Roman aqueduct, except you take your cruise ship down the aqueduct.
So the cruise ship went over the road or over the, oh, wow.
Yeah, that's new to me. I saw something kind of similar in Scotland. It's the only thing I can compare it to, where instead of a lock, it was almost like a large bathtub that the vessels would get in, and then the bathtub would then ride a wheel that would be rotated up and over a roadway. And I don't know the engineering rationale from that, other than it was absolutely fascinating to watch it happen from an engineering perspective. But yeah, I'm sorry, I really can't add any insight to the second question.
One question from home regarding the Holland Channel. Do the plans include increasing the height of the north side of the channel?
John, do you know that one?
When you say increasing the height of the channel, I assume you're referring to increasing the height of the pier structure and breakwater. Is that correct?
I believe that's what they're asking, yes.
Okay. That is something that we're going to look at. One of the administration's pushes, and one of the things that we do always look at when we're doing repairs, is climate resiliency, coastal resiliency due to climate change. So that is something we look at. I don't know the answer if we are planning to raise it, but that is something we look at whenever we do modifications to a breakwater.
Yeah, a question and a couple of thoughts. You said the original pole lock, I think it was, or one of them there, it lasted nearly 100 years or 90 years already here. Will the new lock, is the life expectancy of that going to be similar? And also now people get so frustrated with highways being built, whether it's the Paul Henry one we had here built 20 years ago and had to be reconstructed now. Will the life be there, and are the costs reasonable? Are there excessive regulations or whatever that we can't afford to rebuild our infrastructure now? What changed from the past when we built all these dams and highways and everything else?
John, I don't know if you know the answer to that one. I could take a stab. But
yeah, I can speak in some generalities. So I guess the first question is about the design life and the estimated life of these massive infrastructure up there. In Sioux State Marine specifically, we're very adept at keeping old equipment running and manufacturing or mechanical engineering of it, and the folks up there know the ins and outs of every bit of equipment up there. They've kept the MacArthur lock up and running since I believe it was in the 1920s. The current Poe lock has been in function since I believe the late 50s. The dewatering wells have been there for near a century. We have the oldest hydropower unit in the core in Unit 10, which has been operational for nearly 100 years and is still operating. When the Corps of Engineers makes these large investments, especially with a lock and critical infrastructure, they are built not to be too not to use too much of the adage of the Corps, but it is truly built strong, and it is built to last. Our minimum design life of these infrastructure projects is 50 years. Often our goal is to make them last in perpetuity. The MacArthur lock itself, being as old as it is and being undersized for current traffic, it really, we could keep it running. The issue is more or less the size of it, not having the draft and not having the depth of today's modern vessels. The modern vessels are specifically sized essentially to the PO lock and the new lock as well. So between these two locks, honestly, I foresee them functioning. The PO lock, even though it's 50, 60 years old, will go on for decades still. The new lock will require minimal maintenance for decades, and then as it ages, there'll be increased, funding need. Kind of to your second part of the question about how did the country's infrastructure, why is it we seem to not be able to afford the country's infrastructure needs? That's more of a historical perspective of budgeting. For many years and many decades, the maintenance needs on infrastructure were deferred because it's very expensive. I think in general, we know that the longer you defer maintenance, the more expensive those maintenance needs are. So I think you can see, an increase in budgets over the past, 10 to 15 years, and a general consensus across the industry that the infrastructure of our country needs massive reinvestment. So, I don't think any of us know whether or not our government will continue to increase that funding, but I think it is personally, I think it's critical to fund that infrastructure and keep it running. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think our time is up. I invite you to stick around and talk to Jim. And I'd like to thank Jim and Jesse and John for a great presentation.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it. And I'll catch up with you when I'm back in the office.